Going to be discussing absolute value equations and inequalities. Since this is a review, it's just going to be a quick overview. But essentially, the only difference between these equations and inequalities is the initial setup. Once we set up the problem, or set up the equation, then it is a standard equation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that setup. First off, we want to get to where the absolute value itself, so the absolute value of something, don't quite know what, but we need that to be equal to a number. So we're just going to use 5 in this case. Now, why do we need this setup? Because the absolute value by itself tells us that we can either be positive 5 or negative 5. So this splits into two separate problems. U equals 5, U equals negative 5. And then we would end up solving both if we needed to. So let's kind of look at this equation on the left. Here we have this 4 outside of my absolute value. So the first thing I need to do is I need to divide both sides by 4. And if we divide both sides by 4, we end up with 3x minus 1 inside my absolute value is equal to 2. And now we have our absolute value by itself. So what we end up with is 3x minus 1 equals 2. And we have 3x minus 1 equals negative 2. And then we solve these two problems separately. So add 1 to both sides of the equation. 3x is equal to 3. Divide both sides by 3. And we end up with x equals 1. That is one of our possible answers. The other possible answer we find by solving this second equation, where we first add 1 to both sides to undo our subtraction. We're left with 3x equals negative 1, and then we divide both sides by 3, and we end up with x equals negative 1/3. So here are our two possible answers, and we could list it as x equals 1 or x equals negative 1/3, but we're going to write it as a solution set. So this is just a set that is comprised of the solutions to an equation. It's in the name. And there's our final answer. All absolute value equations work like this. The important thing to note is the absolute value of a number cannot be negative. So if we had something like the absolute value of 3x minus 1 equals negative 8, this is always true because our absolute value itself always results in a positive number. So this right here is a true statement. So this would be infinitely many solutions, or this would be called an identity. So do keep that in mind, that we do need to think about the meaning of this sum. Now let's look at our inequalities real quick, because they are similar in the fact that we're going to have to first have our absolute value by itself, so this means that we can't be multiplying anything to the absolute value. We cannot be subtracting or adding anything to the absolute value. But once we have it like this, we then need to get our setup done. And this side sets up as an AND. So we would have 3x minus 5 is less than or equal to 10, and 3x minus 5 is greater than or equal to 10. Those are our two possibilities. Then we would solve each of these individually. So adding 5 to both sides of my equation, ending up with 3x is less than or equal to 15. Divide each side by 3, ending up with x is less than or equal to 5. And on my right-hand side, we would add 5 to both sides of our equation, and then we would have 3x is greater than or equal to 15. Oh, negative 10 is greater than or equal to negative 5. And then we divide both sides by 3. And we end up with x is greater than or equal to negative 5/3. And this is our solution, these two items. Over here, when we have a greater than inequality, what we really are looking at is an OR inequality. So we have 3x minus 5 is greater than 10, just greater than 10, or 3x minus 5 is less than negative 10. And we solve both of these. Again, using the same process we did over here on the left. And you can tell, because these are the same numbers, that the only real difference is going to be the signs. So over here we would just end up with, following those steps, we would end up with x is greater than 5, or over here we would end up with x is less than negative 5/3. And these, this is an OR inequality. So really, absolute values allow us to look at constraints very efficiently, which is why it's used in the sciences a lot and in statistics to measure error. Regardless, once we have our setup, we just solve the inequalities like we would any other inequality. When we're solving any other inequality, we follow the same steps we do with an equation, unless we multiply or divide by a negative number, at which point in time we have to change the sign. That does it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.